The Paris Climate Agreement is an international treaty adopted by the United Nations Climate Change Conference, the COP21 conference, in 2015 and entered into force in November 2016. The main focus of this agreement is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 43% compared to 2010 levels by 2030 in order to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. But the carbon emissions continue to rise as we are halfway between 2015, when the agreement was adopted, and the 2030 goals. The COP28 meeting in early December 2023 hopes to make progress with additional agreements to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, including carbon dioxide and methane. Prior to the Paris Agreement, the United States pledged to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 28% compared to 2005 levels. And while progress has been made, we need to do much more hard work in order to reach these goals to limit global warming. Methane is a simple hydrocarbon molecule with a single carbon and 4 hydrogen atoms. More complicated hydrocarbons include fats that store large amounts of energy in our bodies, as well as petroleum products such as gasoline and oil, which store large amounts of energy that can be harnessed when burned. Methane is a primary component of natural gas. It is extremely flammable, so when mixed in air, it can result in an explosion that can generate power similar to the burning of gasoline. The term greenhouse gases is used widely, but what does it mean? In a greenhouse, windows allow sunlight in for plant growth, but it also traps heat energy within the structure. This provides the opportunity to grow plants even when it is cold and snowy outside. Greenhouse gases accumulate in the atmosphere where they mimic the actions of a plant greenhouse. The gases allow sunlight to pass through the atmosphere to reach the surface of the planet, but they prevent the normal loss of heat into space. Similar to a greenhouse, these gases cause the temperature of our planet to warm. Methane is an example of a greenhouse gas with the potential to trap heat in our atmosphere. More potent greenhouse gases, such as fluorinated gases and nitrous oxide, are more effective at trapping heat in the atmosphere. Fluorinated gases are used in refrigerators and aerosol cans, and they're gradually being phased out and being replaced with safer chemicals. Nitrous oxide is produced by burning fossil fuels, and so chemical reactions in our catalytic converters in our cars and the equivalent in fossil fuel burning electricity generation plants convert the dangerous nitrous oxide into less harmful chemicals. Methane emissions, however, are less than carbon dioxide emissions worldwide, but methane has a much greater potential to heat the environment, and it's estimated that methane contributes to about a third of the present global warming. While methane is more potent than carbon dioxide at trapping heat, it breaks down in the atmosphere much quicker. Carbon dioxide may stay in our atmosphere for hundreds or thousands of years, but methane is expected to break down within about 10 years or so. This means that reducing methane emissions now can have a quicker and more dramatic effect at reducing warming in the atmosphere than reductions of carbon dioxide. Scientists predict that we need to reduce methane levels by 30 to 60% below 2020 levels as a lower cost way of limiting global warming to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius over the pre-industrial temperatures. The majority of human-driven methane emissions come from 3 main sectors. Approximately 40% comes from agriculture, about 35% from the burning of fossil fuels, and another 20% from solid waste and wastewater. Approximately a quarter of global greenhouse emissions come from food production, and over half of that comes from livestock. Cows produce methane while they are digesting their food. Suggested ways of reducing this source of greenhouse gases, and in particular methane, is to reduce livestock production. This can be accomplished by humans shifting to a diet with more plant-based proteins. Other options include changing the diet that the cows eat to use materials such as seaweed that can be digested without producing as much methane, And then finally, manure piles release large amounts of methane, so changing waste management practices could dramatically reduce methane emissions coming from agriculture. Methane is also a byproduct of oil, gas, and coal operations. Excess methane is often burned off using flares, but some methane continues to leak into the atmosphere. Improved monitoring for leaks and capturing methane instead of burning it off can significantly reduce methane emissions from fossil fuels. Above ground improvements during oil and gas production can reduce methane emissions up to 100 times lower than high emitting operations. For example, low-producing wells in the United States that are not currently required to use abatement technologies to reduce methane emissions are responsible for about half of the United States carbon dioxide emissions through the production of oil and gas. The cost of these measures is estimated to be about $100 billion by 2030, but that amount represents less than 3% of the net income of the oil and gas industries of 2022. In addition, the methane that's collected in this way to prevent its release can also be sold as natural gas, potentially offsetting the costs of these abatement measures. Waste, such as trash in landfills and sewage wastewater, contributes to about 18% of human-caused methane emissions. Food waste can be separated from the trash and processed in order to produce biogas rather than rotting in landfills and releasing methanes. Other options are actually to collect the methane that is emitted by landfills and using that as a source of natural gas. The Paris Climate Conference was the 21st session of the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so the Conference of Parties corresponds to COP, and so the 21st session in the Paris meetings is often referred to as COP28. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted in 1992 as a treaty among governments, and it provides a foundation for global climate efforts. Developed countries at the Paris Accords have offered absolute economy-wide emissions targets, like the United States, who, for instance, pledged to reduce its emissions by 26 to 28% from the 2005 levels to 2025. These nationally determined contributions were created on a country-by-country basis. Now, the first process of a global stock take, or basically assessing the progress we're made, is going to be occurring in the 2023 December COP28 meetings held in Dubai. If we focus first on the outcome of the Paris Accords and COP21, we see that President Obama signed an executive order for the United States to join the Paris Accords. This executive order was used to join the agreement after the Senate was unable to approve the Kyoto Treaty after 8 years. For example, within hours of the finalization of the Kyoto Agreement, Republican senators declared that it was dead on arrival, since they reported that it would put the United States at an economic disadvantage to reduce greenhouse gas emissions when developing countries were not required to do so. For those reasons, the United States joined the Paris Agreement by executive order rather than ratification of a treaty. The problem with that is that this executive order could only apply to a presidential administration supportive of its goals. While politicians remain divided on the issue of climate change, global warming, and the need to address greenhouse gas emissions, overall, the American public supports action. There remains strong political divisiveness in response, as Democratic voters are more likely to support these initiatives, while Republican voters are more likely to be against these goals. With a change in presidential administrations, President Trump announced in June 2017 that the United States would withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. This withdrawal went into effect in November 2020 because the agreement had rules that no country could announce that they were leaving the agreement until 3 years after the date of ratification, and there was a 1-year notice period. This rule was put into place because of concerns that the internal U.S. politics would disrupt the agreement that the United States was a primary force in negotiating. With the Paris climate deal, originally there were 195 countries that agreed to those accords. With its withdrawal, the United States joined only Syria and Nicaragua as the only countries that are not part of the Paris Climate Agreement. In 2021, in fulfillment of promises made during the presidential campaign, President Biden signed an executive order to rejoin the Paris Agreement on his first day in office. To further support these promises, on December 2, 2023, at the start of the COP28 meetings in Dubai, the United States announced new rules to limit the amount of methane that oil and gas companies can release into the atmosphere. Now, this rule applies to both large and small oil and gas companies, so it is more inclusive than the previous rules that only applied to large operations and allowed for significant leakage of methane into the environment. At the same time, on the opposite side of the planet, at the COP28 meetings in Dubai, there was an agreement by major oil and gas companies that pledged to reduce methane leaks by 2030. Now, climate change activists have responded by calling this greenwashing because they're looking at, these oil companies are looking at reducing emissions rather than completely phasing out or reducing fossil fuel production and use, which is the goal of many climate change activists. So we're in the situation that internal United States politics are incredibly divisive around the issues of climate change and global warming and what to do about greenhouse gases. And while much of the rest of the world is recognizing the risks associated with it and are on board with efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in an effort to limit global warming, we're looking at internal politics of the United States, focusing in on very divergent views on whether or not this is truly a problem and what should be done about it. Similar to the survey results from 2016, just ahead of the COP28 meetings in December of 2023, a survey in November of 2023 again showed that the majority of the American public wants the United States to take ambitious climate action, even if other countries are not doing so. But further illustrating the divisiveness associated with this issue, in general, Democratic voters are more supportive of taking action, and Republican voters are more likely to want to wait or at least to minimize the efforts that are made because of the risk that it would have on having economic impacts. So now we've reached our ethical dilemma in science for this week. Will United States politics doom COP28 goals for reducing methane emissions? The United States was unable to ratify the Kyoto Accords because of concerns of the economic impact were greater than the concerns about the climate. So we are still faced with these questions. Should we reduce methane emissions in spite of the potential economic impact? Currently, reductions are primarily voluntary. If we are going to reduce methane emissions, how should we mandate a reduction in those emissions? And then finally, with the continued political divisiveness and the imminent presidential election of 2024, how do we maintain progress on controversial long-term initiatives such as reducing methane emissions in the midst of political adversity? Thank you for listening to this week's Ethical Dilemma in Science. Please see the description below for additional information and references. You can also leave a comment below with your thoughts on this topic or suggestions for future topics. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and subscribe for more discussions on the ethics and impacts of science on society. Until next time, stay curious and be informed.